Hello, everyone. Welcome to STAT's virtual event, Facing the Crisis of Drug-Resistant Germs, sponsored by Merck. Thanks for joining us. I'm Matt Herper, Senior Writer for Medicine and STAT Editorial Events Director, and we will get started with this event in just a few moments. But first, a few quick housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a few icons. Use the chat feature to talk amongst yourselves or to send a message directly to us at STAT events. Please do not put your questions in the chat. We do really want your questions. If you have a question you'd like to ask one of our featured speakers, please use the Q&A feature to type your question and we will try to answer it live. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and upvote the questions you'd most like to see answered. We will be taking questions throughout the chat, so please don't wait until the end to submit. This is part of what makes these events unique and, we hope, fun. Thanks again to all of you for being here. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome Kenneth E. Thorpe, Professor of Health Policy at Emory University and Chairman of the Partnership to Fight Infectious Disease, for our sponsored introduction to today's event. Take it away, Ken.
Well, thanks, Matthew, and thanks everybody for joining. It's a wonderful panel, as you're going to see. It's especially nice to see Senator Cassidy again, my old flight mate, flying on Delta from Atlanta to DC. So I have not been on that flight for a while, but welcome to all the panelists as well. The COVID-19 crisis has reinforced the critical importance of treatments for infectious diseases. The antibiotics we have relied on for decades are beginning to fail. Common infections are increasingly difficult to treat, and the number of new drugs under development are declining for too many reasons, which is what we'll discuss here today. You're all familiar with the numbers and the data on this. The CDC has estimated that just under 3 million individuals have a drug-resistant infection. I've done some estimates on this that shows that those numbers have doubled over the past 10 years, certainly a distressing statistic. They account for around 36,000 deaths a year. This is an area that we don't have really great surveillance, so it's really difficult to know what the actual numbers are, but that's our best guess. Certainly, as we're going to talk about, the current antibiotic developments are not sufficient. We lack the infrastructure to bring them online and the incentive structure to really accelerate the development. There are several reasons for this that we'll hear about. Certainly the low return on investment, low reimbursement rates, the limited patient population, the real need for post-market incentives, inadequate surveillance are certainly among the problems. We have seen a growth in some very troubling types of infections, particularly these gram-negative bacteria. To try to address this, I've been the chairman for the Partnership to Fight Chronic Disease for over a decade now, something that Senator Cassidy has participated in many of our sessions. We have gone ahead and put together a coalition called the Partnership to Fight Infectious Disease, which is a group of patients, providers, community organizations, academic researchers, business labor groups, and infectious disease experts working to raise awareness of the multiple threats posed by infectious disease. As an initiative of the Chronic Disease Coalition, our Fight Infectious Disease group is exploring and advancing solutions that enhance pandemic preparedness, address the growing threat of antimicrobial resistance and the need for new antimicrobial treatments, and empowering informed choice and confidence in COVID-19 vaccines. The antibiotics we've relied on are continuing to fail us, and that's just a real dilemma. Fortunately, there are some legislative solutions that our group has been working on, and Senator Cassidy is a champion on one of them we'll hear about today. The deal, I think, with both problems. One is the Disarm Act, and the other is Pasteur. They deal with the dual problems of providing financial incentives to develop new medications and new drugs, and also make sure that once they're on the market that they're adequately reimbursed. So both of these pieces of legislation would address the financial incentives for development, as well as providing add-on reimbursements in the Medicare program to make sure that the medications are adequately reimbursed. We are certainly grateful for Merck's leadership on these issues and for sponsoring this critically important discussion today, as the need for action is paramount. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. We have the range of players on the call, from legislative to really important medical thought leaders on this issue. So Matthew, thanks for the introduction, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right. For part one of today's editorial program, we'll be looking at legislative solutions and what we can actually do about this problem. And for that, I'd like to welcome Senator Bill Cassidy. Senator.
Hey, Matthew. Thank you for having me. I appreciate being on.
Thank you so much for being here. I usually try to keep my first questions really short, but a little bit longer. There's a drug called Daptomycin that's made by Merck. And every time I think about this problem, I think about the guy who developed it, who rescued it from Eli Lilly, which didn't want to develop it, and a guy named Francis Talley, who was the lead developer there. And the thing that's always struck me as tragic, aside from the triumph of finally getting this drug to market in 2003, is 3 years later, Francis Talley died of an acute bacterial infection that I believe was drug resistant. So, it kind of always dramatizes for me that this has been a problem for 20 years. We've been talking about it a lot, and there really isn't. And the researchers who knew how to do antibiotics, tragically, Frank died, right? And new blood really hasn't been going into the field because of the lack of venture investment. It's been pretty tough for companies that have tried to do this. So I guess I wanted to start on your perspective on this, on why it's been so hard to get legislative solutions here that will actually take. Well, this has been a really tough problem, and it's obvious that we're seeing what an infectious disease can do to society right now, right? Everywhere we look. The thought of antibiotics not working against germs, so that not only can you not treat infections, but can't do surgeries, all the consequences that those in medicine know about. Why is this such a hard thing to get legislative action on?
So Matthew, a couple things. Let me just say one thing as an introduction. You point out one of the situations. I'm old enough to remember when AIDS came about. And Randy Schultz wrote this great book, and the band played on, quoting the public health officer in San Francisco, who predicted that we could have an epidemic of some sort of sexually transmitted disease that would devastate so many people. And it was predicted, and it happened. So there was like a Cassandra speaking to that. Bill Gates has been speaking of the possibility of a pandemic, such as we've had with COVID. Again, a little bit of a Cassandra, because until it happened, no one really took it seriously. And I don't say no one, but not sufficiently in number in order to address it. So here, there's obviously been, from yours and Ken's comments, an understanding that we could have a antibiotic resistant bacteria that could really devastate a lot of people. Already is, but could even be more so. Now, Congress has attempted to address this. We passed the GAIN Act several years ago, which was attempting to incentivize antibiotic development. But it is more than just Congress acting. You mentioned the absence of venture capital investment. I would argue that all we've done is exposed the difficulty of the market. How to put this? We're asking a drug company to develop a drug which we ask them to only use in very selective cases. So you spend hundreds of millions of dollars to develop a drug, and you only give it to 100,000 patients a year. Now do the math. That's going to be very difficult, and it turns the market economics on top of itself. Again, I'm old enough to remember when a drug called cefotaxime was marketed. and and everybody's going to cringe. But the drug rep would bring lots of lunch. He would show us some slides. We'd eat some good po' boys, and everybody would go on.
It's the old days. These are the real old days. I remember when all this stopped. Yeah.
Totally. And we'd go prescribe a bunch of cefotaxime. And whoever had cefotaxime, Herbst, I think, ended up getting their return on the investment. We got a whole different market here, which is we're going to spend a lot of money to develop for a drug that we hope is rarely used to keep it in reserve for when we really do need it. We've got to figure out that market mechanism, and that's what the Disarm Act is about.
So let's talk about that, because this is one of the, and I've had CEOs at big companies tell me privately that they never want to do an antibiotic again. The idea here is, I mean, for other drugs where there are small populations, the way that problem has been solved is we raise the prices, and we raise the prices astronomically high, and you're trying to create more of a market with this act. Explain how it would work.
So first, remember that I don't know most of, but a heck of a lot of patients with these terrible infections are either on Medicaid or they are on Medicare, and oftentimes both. They're elderly, they're dual eligibles, they've got multiple diseases. And if you're on a Medicare, if you're a Medicare patient and you're hospitalized, the hospital is being reimbursed by a diagnostic related group. They're getting X number of dollars for that hospital stay, whether or not the patient gets out of the hospital in one day or whether or not they get out 6 months later. Now, there's some nuance to that, but just hang with me in the concept. So if all of a sudden you take a drug which is very expensive and you add it to the mix, the entirety of the hospital's margin might go away. Now, you could argue, wait a second, if the patient gets out of the ICU sooner because we have just the right antibiotic to address the infection, then maybe they would still get their margin because it would be, they're getting out of the hospital sooner. One, it presumes that you still don't know the price of the drug. And secondly, a lot of these patients have underlying conditions. So even if you treat the infection, they still may die, or they still may be in the hospital for other reasons. So the fact that Medicare is a primary payer in this, I think, complicates. And the fact that you have a set price for that hospitalization, again, complicates. And that's what we're attempting to address with the Disarm Act.
So give people a little more of a sense of how it works. I mean, it's essentially, you pay more for the antibiotic at the end of the day, right? That's the bottom line. Currently,
under the current system, let's say that Bill Cassidy goes into the hospital. I have a few people right now who wish that I would. I go into the hospital with a terrible infection. They could give me a drug which would address whatever infection I have, which is probably off patent, which is going to be very cheap. Or they could give me a drug which I'm going to be charged, $400,000 for a course of. Now that $400,000 will help the drug company meet their cost of investment, but it's going to totally blow away the margin the hospital would have. What we're attempting to do with the Disarm Act is to give, if you will, an epi payment. If the hospital has a suitable means to restrict the use of the antibiotic to only those cases that are indicated, then there would be an additional payment over and above the DRG that would compensate for the use of the drug.
So what do you see as being your hurdles in getting this through then?
One of it is just making people aware. Now think about it. In the early 80s, there was a prescient public health doctor in San Francisco who warned about the threat of just imagine that we could have a terrible venereal disease that would rip through the sexually active. Or all those people, planning for the pandemic began under George W. Bush and was continued under Obama. But we never had the systems developed in our country, such as were developed in Germany, for example, in terms of how to develop it. So you can imagine it, but it doesn't mean that imagination activates you to address this. And those who imagine it are usually a minority of the people involved. So first thing we have to do is educate legislators and the executive branch as to that this is a real problem. previous legislative efforts have not succeeded. There needs to be another effort, and we're going to structure it this way, and this is the reason why. By the way, thank you for this conference. Part of that education process, granted, many people on here would agree already with everything we're saying, but part of this process is to just spread the word. We got to spread the word.
And how would you prioritize different approaches to incentivization? I mean, you're talking about a reimbursement-based approach. People talk about vouchers a lot. There's also the Pasteur Act, which I'm getting a lot of questions in the Q&A about. How do you prioritize and decide between these different approaches? I mean, it seems part of the problem is that even once we decide that we're going to do something, there are too many options, and we argue about them.
Well, first, let's say, there's an old Warren Zevon song. He's been arrested and he's in a Turkish jail for selling drugs.
I love that song.
Yeah, and he writes his dad, send lawyers, guns, and money.
Yes.
So on the one hand, maybe we need to take a lawyers, guns, and money approach. We can't just do one thing; we have to do multiple things. But I do think that a multiplicity of approaches. Clearly, if you have an epi payment, as we are speaking of with the Disarm Act, that could benefit for those who are taking care of Medicare patients or perhaps even Medicaid patients. But if you have the commercially insured, they would have to follow that model. Alternatively, people again have spoken of some of the things you've mentioned, or can we have a subscription model where you pay a certain fee and if you need to, then you can pull it down. I would like to have a series of hearings in which we would discuss this and try and come to some idea of the best direction for all facets, the commercial insurance, the Medicare, the Medicaid, and then give enough latitude to the agencies to implement those policies.
So there's a question here that I really wanted to ask from the audience, because I feel like it's the question we always get about this, which is how do we assure the public gets its money's worth when we give financial incentives to private companies? People often, sometimes with justification and very good examples, think of the drug industry as kind of bilking the public coffers, and are immediately afraid that any of these steps will turn into that. How do you balance that? Do you worry about that at all? What's your...
Well, first, right now, we are not getting our dollars worth because the federal taxpayer has put hundreds of millions of dollars to the development of antibiotics, some of which have now been sold to other companies because there was no market. And so all that investment is gone. I think there's a company out of India that now controls one of the success stories. Think about it. We paid hundreds of millions of dollars, and the company out of India bought it for a song because the company which developed it could no longer afford to continue with it. So we do need to think differently. Now, if you mean, can drug companies arbitrage regulations to their financial advantage? That's does a bear defecate in the woods? I mean, you know what I'm saying? Of course, that's a risk, but we can't. But when we go into that, we have to kind of think very seriously about how to prevent that from happening, but recognizing that unless we have drug companies as our partners, this will not happen. And there have been great partnerships with pharmaceutical companies to develop agents that we know we needed. Operation Warp Speed is an example. So just because there are examples of arbitrage of regulations to the financial advantage of one of the entities, I would argue that we have a recent example of great cooperation, which brought about great societal benefit. So I'm not going to be dissuaded from the potential of a partnership by the failures of such partnerships and other things.
Question from Nicholas Harrison. Can BARDA incentivize additional antibiotic development by funding an antibiotic-specific center that provides flexible and affordable U.S. manufacturing capacity? How do you think about, I mean, that's really creating more options. Do you think that would work in this situation, or is the market too broken that even if you create a bunch of antibiotics at BARDA, they don't get to market?
See, I don't know that. You'd have to look at the spreadsheet and see where is the hangup. but it still seems that you need to have this tension. You got to have a drug which is very expensive to develop, but which is rarely prescribed. And so so it may be that you decide that you're going to just subsidize it as a social good. The federal taxpayer will just pay for it and provide it at low cost to whomever needs it. And you'd have to pencil that out. For whatever reason, intuitively, it seems to me, it would be better to have that. It seems like that would lend itself to overuse. If you make something available at a low cost, it is typically overused, whether it's bread, gasoline, or whatever. But if you make it, boy, this is pretty expensive, but we are going to get an epi payment that covers our cost, but you still have to first gulp when you swallow that expense and wait for 2 months to get paid. For some reason, that seems as if that would lead to more judicious use. But I'll go back to Warren Zevon. I'm willing to consider lawyers, guns, and money if we're going to get ourselves out of this.
So another thoughtful question here from Carol Guacero. What about orphan drugs? They get approved, that works. Why isn't that same model working for antibiotics? Aren't these essentially orphan drugs at this point, antibiotics for resistant infections?
In concept, they are. Now, of course, in orphan drugs, I don't think you're constrained by the fact that you have a DRG, which limits your payment.
You are not.
You're not.
Yeah.
And I do think it took me a while to get my head around why this is such a problem, until I realized that if not the majority of, a substantial portion of reimbursement is going to come on Medicare patients who are hospitalized. And that inherently is a limit upon reimbursement for the hospital to receive for the cost of that care, even though the hospital will be obligated to compensate whatever the market price is for that drug. I think that DRG proportion is that which illuminates the problem for me.
And another interesting question here, do you see a role for prioritizing certain diseases? Tuberculosis is mentioned. We obviously have a big problem with drug-resistant gonorrhea. How much does that go into your thinking as you're thinking about these approaches?
Well, great thought. You'd want to have some sort, if you're going to incentivize, let me start over. You got a mechanism here. Under the GAIN Act, we did ask FDA to prioritize those infectious agents which were of a greater priority. Now, and obviously the greater the prevalence or the greater the infectivity, presumably some metric involving both of those as a factor would determine which was the greater priority. So I think whichever you would incentivize, you would try and have some metric. The degree to which it's resistant, the degree to which it's prevalent, and the degree to which it's dangerous to society. That said, I'd like to think that we could focus on more than one. That's the nice thing about having private industry involved. You have multiple researchers who would take a risk. Some may do this, some may do that. If my whole life has been studying tuberculosis, I would do tuberculosis. But if my whole life has been doing gram negatives, I would do gram negatives. So I do think that we could cover more than just one. But we do have a mechanism by which FDA would establish a hierarchy of sorts.
What do you think COVID helps us or hurts us in terms of getting this done? I mean, obviously it shows us what an infectious disease can do. I think that was hard even for those of us who'd been imagining it to really imagine what this would all feel like right now. But it also means everybody's pretty busy with that for quite a while. In terms of actually getting some legislative action, do you think that that's a help or a hindrance to you?
I think it's a tremendous help, because people who formerly had their minds occupied by other issues, and very important issues, but perhaps not healthcare issues, suddenly have opened up a portion of their bandwidth to consider those issues related to healthcare. And so we see across a range of healthcare issues, telehealth as one example, things that people were not even thinking of, now they're trying to address. So I actually think it's helpful, and now's the time to make the case.
There's an entrepreneur I was talking to about this once who'd started an antibiotic company that did not succeed. Told me that he thought that he said, we spend all our time in the lab. We spend all our time on the science. And if and when I do antibiotics again, I think I'm going to spend all my time in DC because that's the bigger problem for us. What would you tell that entrepreneur now?
I would tell him, I agree. Again, I go back to this, it is a very curious market mechanism. A lot of your antibiotic is going where there's inelastic reimbursement for the entity which is using the drug. And that's why you opened up asking, why hasn't Congress done anything? I pushed back, we've done something, but we failed to realize the degree to which there are market constraints.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure there's any other product I know of, very expensive to develop, and we're going to ask people not to use it. So how do you, and there's a fixed reimbursement if you do.
Mm-hmm.
One of those three has got to resolve, right?
Right.
And
maybe the only product in the drug industry where you don't have an elastic price. I mean, that's why drug prices are so high, right?
An elastic reimbursement,
Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
Now, and now if you really want to take this conversation far afield, you go to the German model where they actually have some way of pricing new drugs. And after the end of the year, they reevaluate as to whether or not it's a fair reimbursement, and you could adjust your DRG so that it's not an epi payment, but rather it's if you've got a highly resistant drug X, if you have a highly resistant infectious agent, then we're going to give you a DRG up here if, taking into account that you might have to use one of these expensive drugs. But even that is a little bit of a chicken and egg concept, because you'd first have to have the antibiotic to use, and you'd have to know the cost of the antibiotic. So there's kind of a...
I'm not aware of antibiotics being developed for the German market.
I'm not either, but they at least have a means by which you can come to a price which the payor can agree upon, and therefore factor the price of that drug into their reimbursement rate. That's my point. Right now, we don't have a way for the payor as integral to their reimbursement on a capitated payment or a limited payment to factor in the cost of the drug.
And one thing that often comes up in these discussions when you bring up drugs not reaching the market is the FDA a bottleneck here in this case? Or is that not the case now?
I don't, it's always easy to say that the FDA is, and it's a safe answer. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, when I speak to people in industry, they don't point to FDA as the most difficult issue. They point to reimbursement issues and that tension, which I mentioned earlier. Expensive to develop, but please don't use it. And by the way, we're not going to pay you if you do.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. I hope you're keeping warm.
Yeah, I am keeping warm. It's rare that I have a conversation I get to quote Warren Zevon, so thank you.
It's rare that I have someone and it's like you snuck into my Spotify. So so thanks for that. Thank you so much, Senator.
Bye-bye.
So on to part 2 of today's event. Here to take a closer look at the problem of antimicrobial resistance and why it hasn't been solved, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Ed Silverman, our Pharmalot columnist, senior writer here at STAT and Pharmaceutical Reporting Institution. Ed.
Hi, Matt. And hi, everyone. Thanks for showing up today. We appreciate it. This is a fascinating topic, and the conversation we just heard was very interesting. Thanks again to Senator Cassidy. We have, where are those? Well, we have a nice lineup today. We have Evan Lowe, who heads Paratech Pharmaceuticals. We have Gail Hansen, who is a consultant, used to be with Pew Charitable Trust, where she focused on antibiotics. And we also have Helen Boucher, who is a physician and specializes in infectious diseases at Tufts Medical Center. I want to thank all of you for agreeing to be on the panel today. So Helen, I'd like to start with you from the perspective of clinician, being in the field, studying infectious disease, um, wondering just how bad it is, because I recall a survey last year, and it was from Pew Charitable Trust, in fact. 94% of doctors agree that and this is in the US, 94% of doctors agree that antibiotic resistance is a national issue, but just 55% see this as a problem in their own practices. I thought that was a remarkable finding, and I'm wondering if that's a bit of a canary in the coal mine, or if it's just a blind spot that is, it's called stewardship. If it's a blind spot, that's really just not being sufficiently addressed.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for having me, Ed. The problem is bad, right? So the pandemic of antibiotic resistance was here before COVID, and it's still here. It's not going away. This week, we heard about a multi-drug resistant Salmonella typhoid bug in our country in people who didn't even travel. Really scary. And I would say that as an infectious disease doctor, of course, I see people with infections. And sadly, I, just like my colleagues all across the country, have seen patients for whom we had no antibiotic options. So people who we had to deny therapy, like a transplant, a joint replacement, because they had an infection that we couldn't treat. When I started, nearly 30 years ago, that was unheard of. It's a rare event now, but it happens. And I would say that all of us in infectious diseases in this country have dealt with it. In parts of the world, it's worse, and it's not going away. So I think the answer to the survey reflects the fact, perhaps, that some of those clinicians haven't dealt with that very painful example where we had to really face an untreatable infection yet. But if we don't deal with this, we know that more and more will have to.
How do we, just to follow up on that, how do we collectively as a society raise that awareness level if physicians who are trained to understand the problem aren't aware of the extent of the problem, at least as they see it up close? How do we get from here to there? And that these are in offices around the country, whether they're single practitioners, they're part of larger hospital groups, what have you. It is a troubling insight. And I'm wondering then, how do we extend that awareness to smaller hospital groups that are just so busy and of course overwhelmed, as we all know, unfortunately, due to COVID right now?
Yeah, so the awareness issue is a huge one, right? There is no breast cancer coalition for antibiotic resistance. And it's a real issue. And people at the Wellcome Trust and others have studied this. We're 10 years in, at least, into calling to action about antibiotic resistance. We're more than 5 years into the National Action Plan, yet not enough people in the public understand that this is a real problem that affects them. It's likely that all of us or our family members have been affected by this in one way or another. It's complicated, it's a wicked problem, and I think part of it has been delayed because it's not any one population of patients, it's all patients who are at risk from this. And there's another layer, it's changing, but as recently as a couple of years ago, no hospital in the United States would want to be known for being a center of antibiotic resistance, right? There's this concern that shouldn't happen at my hospital, it shouldn't happen under my watch. And I think that's led to some difficulty. We're making a little bit of progress. The pediatricians have made progress. I think a lot of us as parents understand more from our pediatricians that overuse of antibiotics is a problem, but we still have a long way to go, as you point out. And I think, we're working on education at the high school level, actually. Just like recycling didn't change until kids came home from school and told their parents about it, we're actually doing some initiatives to reach out to younger students about this problem that affects, people, animals, and the environment.
You mentioned the word animals. It's a perfect time for me to pivot to Gail Hansen, who I'd like to ask a little bit about the notion of food-producing livestock. I think that that's something that really goes over people's heads. They're not aware of it. They don't understand necessarily how that fits into this problem. Maybe you could take just a moment to explain what it's like right now, how much progress, if any, has been made over the last few years. Senator Cassidy mentioned the FDA. I know, Gail, you and I have talked over time about FDA efforts. Where does that stand? How much progress has been made, and what's lacking that we still have problems with antibiotic usage in the food chain that is contributing to the greater resistance issue?
Thank you for having me and for such a simple question. I think something that people tend to forget is that it isn't the person who becomes resistant to antibiotics, it's the bacteria. So bacteria affect animals besides people and are used in animals besides people. And the same antibiotics that are used in people are often the same ones that are used in animals and used a lot in food animals. So antibiotics are given to animals to treat disease as they are in people, but they're also used to prevent disease and to control disease a lot more often than they are in people. And there's a lot more animals, even in the United States. But sort of also remember that antibiotic resistance doesn't really respect national borders. And I think, as Senator Cassidy mentioned as well, that COVID has at least gotten people to start thinking about things in international terms and in terms of health not respecting any kind of borders. As far as how much is used in animals, I think in the last 10 years or so, we have seen a difference and a decrease in the use of antibiotics in our poultry production in the United States. At one point, nearly every chicken in the United States got an antibiotic. Now that may not seem like a lot, but that's 9 billion with a B animals per year. And so each animal that gets antibiotics is either, you can think of them as either a potential petri dish or a potential amplifier of antibiotic resistance. So if you've got 9 billion of them a year in the United States, that's 9 billion chances for bad things to happen. So the poultry industry has really decreased their use of antibiotics. FDA has instituted some regulations so that antibiotics cannot be used legally in the US anymore to give to animals to get them to grow faster. Even 5 years ago, antibiotics were able to be given to animals over the counter in very low amounts to get them to grow faster. We didn't exactly know how that happened. We knew it did. That way of giving antibiotics, that reason for giving antibiotics has gone away. And there's been much more use of antibiotics given back to veterinarians and health professionals than we had before. There's a lot fewer antibiotics over the counter, but it's still a major problem. And we still have that problem of antibiotic resistance. Bacteria are not only, do they not respect borders, but they're pretty promiscuous. So when one type of antibiotic or one type of bacteria will often make another bacteria will pick up that antibiotic resistance. So we run into that issue as well.
Is the issue or a key issue here that there's just really no way to properly find the right balance, the sweet spot between the proper use of the food producing livestock, whether it's a question of prevention versus treatment? Is there a way to enforce that? Or is that really the problem here that can't easily be rectified?
I think it's another, as Helen Boucher mentioned, another wicked problem where different parts of the world have attacked it differently. In the United States, we have, for the most part, said, okay, we're not going to allow that use in animals to get them to grow faster. But what kind of oversight do we have? It's pretty much up to the veterinarians to do that oversight. There's not a lot of consequences for not following the rules at this point. So, you know, the mechanisms for having that happen and sort of finding the sweet spot, what's the right amount of antibiotic for use in food animals? And I don't have the answer to that. I don't know that anybody does. We sort of titrate it. You sort of say, okay, we know we shouldn't be using it for growth promotion. How much should we be using for prevention and control? Treatment, I can't imagine saying, no, we wouldn't use it for treatment, just from humanitarian standpoint. But what is how do we find that right spot? I think it's just sort of, we keep going until we say, oh, now we're having a problem. We need to sort of go back to, one step. So it isn't necessarily a forward only progression.
And okay, so Evan, I'd like to turn to you, ask you a question. The pharmaceutical industry several months ago announced this ambitious for-profit venture in which 23 big drug makers agreed to invest a total of $1 billion to become partners in what they're calling the AMR Action Fund. And there was a big splashy announcement. I think it was in July. This morning, they announced that they've hired their first CEO. It's the first tangible step we've heard since the summer. A fellow named Henry Skinner. He's currently at an investment firm up in Boston, Tekla Capital. He used to run the Novartis Business Venture Fund. He's a trained microbiologist. They've got lots of money. Their goal, as you know, but just in case folks aren't aware, is between now and 2030 to hopefully come out with 2 to 4 novel antibiotics. And they'll do this by either acquiring or investment in certain small companies. They've got backing from the European Investment Bank, which has agreed to put up some money as well. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, running a much smaller company, you're in the trenches, to what extent is this a feasible idea? Is it another bridge, which Skinner, in fact, used that description himself when I talked to him yesterday about his new job? What kind of potential is there? And I ask this because we heard Senator Cassidy earlier tell Matt Herper, we do need the pharmaceutical industry here. Are these big bucks from these big companies enough to get us going? Or is it maybe too little too late, and maybe we'll see a couple of novel antibiotics a few years from now, but meanwhile, we still have these Herculean problems?
You know, I think it's really great that they want to do something like this. I think it's newsworthy, you know, to say that that potentially is a solution. But I think 2 to 4 new antibiotics over the next 10 years is actually quite dismal as a goal. And I think that, you know, what we have missed here, and is exactly what Senator Cassidy was talking about, is that if you do not have a vibrant ecosystem that rewards and recognizes the value of these products in their use in appropriate patients, it's always about the right antibiotic for the right patient at the right time. Helen knows that. I know that when I was at the bedside for many, many years. And I think that what you might see here is that over that 10-year period of time, Ed, that you develop these new antibiotics and there's no marketplace for it. Who's going to market it at the end of the day? And if you really have to really consider what Senator Cassidy has been talking about, which is that we do need to have a reimbursement system that has elasticity and recognition for value. And if you look at the combination of what's happened in the last 10 years, Helen can comment on this better than I can, is that virtually every major hospital system in the country here today has committed to stewardship. And there are protocols in place that recognize the appropriate type of patients that should use these novel antibiotics. That being said, formularies have been hiding behind stewardship and using price because of that fixed DRG system to say no to antibiotics. And it's no in an absolute sense, not even having these antibiotics on their formulary or on their shelves for a doctor to choose for the 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 patients to get there, to be able to have that antibiotic be available. Helen can't get it from me. If Helen wants it today for a patient today that's going to die tomorrow, she can't get it because we don't have the ability to do that as a small biotech company. There are no big pharma companies essentially that are in this particular space, Ed. And, you know, it's really left to us as small biotech companies to be able to create this marketplace. The marketplace is fragile, it's failing, and it's not vibrant. It does not have deep innovation. And if you look at today's marketplace, for the companies that own 95% of the innovation today, which is in small companies like Paratech, I can tell you from a recent analysis from Alan Carr from Needham, 5 out of the 9 companies that have either a late phase 3 or a marketed product do not have enough capital on their balance sheet to last out 2021. This year, they will run out of capital, which means their technology will either be sold to an Indian company like Senator Cassidy said, or the product will never see the light of day and a physician will never have access to that type of technology. So I think the AMR Action Fund is, I think, well-intended, but if there's not a dynamic marketplace, no one's going to buy it, no one's going to be able to sell it, and it'll be a lost leader.
Is there, I'll just throw this question out, is there, and this might be a very bigger picture, top-down question, but is there a way to look at international collaboration, data harmonization, for instance, that would allow trial results to be gathered and given to regulators in different countries? Is that feasible? Is that just too pie in the sky right now because there are too many different issues involved in getting different entities working together like that?
Well, I'll give you a real life example, which is Paratech. We had agreements with the FDA that they created a more flexible development pathway for our lead product, Nuzyra, for a single skin trial and a single pneumonia trial to have approval in both of those indications. And that was, I think, driven, as Senator Cassidy said, through the GAIN Act and through the QIDP designation. So, thank you, Senator Cassidy, and all of the legislators who put that through. Paratech wouldn't be here if we didn't have that legislation. But that was just getting to approval. I can tell you that same package that we took to Europe, exactly the same data upon which we got approval in the US with a broad-based label consistent with the strong attributes of this product. Europe said, come back with another pneumonia trial. We're not going to give you that indication. And pneumonia has a bigger issue with regards to resistant bacteria. And so guess what? We pulled our application and we'll say, we'll come back when we finish that trial. That means that Europe will not have access to our product for the next 5+ years. Is that acceptable to society today for them not to have this technology because the regulators can't get on the same page and are still thinking that we have to have a registration dossier that obviates any potential safety risk in a setting in which these antibiotics are used as life-saving therapies for the most desperately ill patients? I find that unconscionable and personally an affront to my education as a physician to limit that kind of technology. And guess what? Europe is not going to have our technology. And so patients, guess what? Are going to die if they have a resistant bacteria that would have been saved by my antibiotic. And that's just one example of where regulatory disharmonization leads to lack of access to cutting edge new technology.
And I know that WHO has certainly tried to get harmonization of all of this to happen globally. And basically you're trying to get 198 countries to agree on anything. Think of how hard it is to get 50 states to agree on anything. And the different countries have different values. So, what's of value to the US may be different from what's of value to, a country in the EU. I don't know how to solve that, but I think if we have the collective belief that that's a good goal, then that we should be working towards that goal. How we exactly get there, I don't have that answer.
Here's a question from someone in the audience. What novel technologies and/or approaches are top of mind for combating AMR, and can precision approaches be applied given the current treatment paradigm for bacterial infections?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a stab. There are a lot of novel approaches, and there's really exciting science and early development, right? So CARB-X, this public-private partnership that the government and many others are supporting, has produced a number of really exciting technologies. So drug technologies, phage, bacteriophage technology, that can be very personalized and precision-based, microbiome affecting products, monoclonal antibodies, and vaccine, which we don't even often talk about, but is a major tool for AMR. And if we think there's no market for drugs, the vaccine is a nightmare. All of those have made it, in terms of the science, and proven, I think, that there is a scientific basis for optimism. The issue is that CARB-X is delivering these products that might be ready to go into people, but without the promise of a market. We the doctors hear that no one's going to be interested to take them forward. And so, as a physician, I'm worried for my patients. As a taxpayer, I'm worried that all this investment is not going to come to fruition. And I think that is really a concern.
Yeah, the only, to build on that, Helen, you're absolutely right. Thank you for that. The only access that small companies have today to develop these products coming out of your labs at CMAR or elsewhere is through the venture capital community. And the venture capitalists, because of the fact that there is no vibrant market for these products after approval, they have all said, until we see a company that's successful, that can get to profitability and stand on their own, we're not going to give you any more dollars. So Carbex is going to be promoting all of this great science into a parking lot where there is no exit.
Here's a question for you, Evan, specifically, I guess, is the problem you face with the EMA, is it the EMA or is it the payers in Europe?
I think it's both. I mean, EMA has said we have to do another pivotal trial, which will cost me another $30 to $40 million and another 3 years of development time. And then we've got to go through a regulatory process again. So there's a time delay there. I think that, you know, Gail, you're exactly right as well, is that in addition to that, once we get approval, every country has a pricing committee that we've got to actually navigate through. And every country will have a different threshold for what they think equates to appropriate societal value that they're willing to pay for a novel antibiotic. And we as a small company don't have the resources to do that. And I can tell you historically, even when I was working for big pharma, that pricing negotiation on a country by country basis through all the European individual states can take 2+ years to get pricing over that period of time. And until you have pricing, you're never going to launch that product into those marketplaces. And there are some companies that will give you a price where it is so low that, you know, my view always is that we are not obligated to sell our product at a loss. Because if it costs us $1 billion in total capital to get a product approved, there's got to be a way for us to recoup that investment for our investors and for us to remain viable.
With all the emergent strains or variants, unfortunately, of COVID-19, is there a way to marry that with the problem of AMR right now? I guess one question is, I'd like to add to that is just how bad should we expect the AMR problem to get due to the pandemic? And you know, essentially, another way of asking that first question is, how much of an opportunity does this present to both scientifically, but also in terms of health policy, wed the two problems together, perhaps accelerate some sort of solution? I realize that's not a pricing issue, but in terms of awareness, in terms of research, in terms of policy, is this a moment?
Yeah, I think it is a moment, right? So what we're finding now, 1 year into the COVID epidemic, is that we have better ways to treat COVID disease. And I'm on service in the hospital this week. We're much better at treating this disease. But we do see, especially in the people who get very sick and have to be in the ICU for a longer period of time, we see secondary bacterial infections. We think they're relatively rare, maybe 10 to 15%. We're still learning what the epidemiology is. But in those individuals who have survived through the COVID, to succumb to a drug-resistant infection is a horrible thing, right? It's a horrible thing to lose any patient. So we are seeing the juxtaposition of the two. Stewardship is very important, right? We learned at the beginning of the epidemic, we were way overusing antibiotics initially. We've learned how to use them more prudently, and we need to do that to preserve the armamentarium that we have. But I do think this is a moment. And as every month goes by, AMR is not going away, right? So that example of the Salmonella typhi, and there was an Acinetobacter outbreak, you know, other things continue to happen. They may not make the front page of the New York Times, but this is still with us and it's not going away. And so to your question, Ed, of how bad can it get, you know, I still think that the O'Neill report is the worst case scenario. It's a very staggering number, right? If we do nothing, the deaths from AMR will outpace cancer and other things combined by the year 2050. So we definitely have to act.
Well, AMR is the pandemic that no one talks about.
Mm-hmm.
It is underlying every patient every day that goes to a hospital. Because as you know, Helen, there's no procedure in the hospital that isn't successful with an adjuvant antibiotic. And in that particular case, you know, if we don't actually address something here, you know, we're going to have, like the O'Neill report said, in 2050, 30 years from now, 10 million patients per year globally will be dying from a drug-resistant infection. Just have to ask society the question, is that okay? Because the paradox here is that antibiotics are life-saving therapies. No one debates that. They are life-saving therapies, and we're willing to pay $50 to $100 to $500,000 a year for a novel oncology product that can maybe extend your life for 6 months. And I think that's great for certain individuals. That is really great. But for a life-saving therapy, we are unwilling to pay more than $10 a day for a dose of an antibiotic. And I'm not saying they're meant to be panaceas, and I'm not saying that new novel antibiotics should be used for everybody. No one believes that that's the case. That is not consistent with stewardship. They are not panaceas. But for the right patient at the right time, if you don't have access to it, and Helen knows this, if you don't treat them early enough, they're going to get far enough along where you're going to have a tremendous amount of challenges with regards to being able to treat these patients. You know, Neil Clancy just recently reported out of the University of Pittsburgh in his autopsy study from postmortem studies, both in Europe and the US, that a third of his postmortem studies demonstrated secondary evidence for secondary bacterial infections. And I think that that's a wake-up call. And that speaks to not being able to treat patients way at the end of the line, but treating them more earlier, as Helen said, judiciously and appropriately.
I think using the COVID pandemic as sort of not letting a crisis go to waste, so to speak, and using this as a tool to get people to understand the effects of antimicrobial resistance and the huge part of that, and how big that problem is, and to somehow not lose momentum, because it's very easy for, in the heat of the moment, in the heat of COVID, everybody's working on that now, and then 5 years from now, what's going to happen? Can we get AMR, antimicrobial resistance, on the map, and can we sustain that? Because we're never going to get rid of resistance, but how are we going to deal with it?
Yeah, all of these legislative ideas and concepts, such as the Disarm Act, just so you know, past year as well, there's very clear language about commitments to stewardship, and no one gets access to those kind of reimbursements unless they, as a company, also participate in reporting from a surveillance perspective, so we know what's going on the ground. That's really, really important. I know that hospitals are committed to that. I know physicians are committed to that. We as an industry are committed to that as well. But the absence of surveillance, the absence of data, is because guess what? Companies are not surviving. That's one of our obligations that the FDA asks us to do for a 5-year period of time, is to do bacterial surveillance for the development of resistance. That's not being done because guess what? Companies are going bankrupt and not surviving. So you're getting zero data that clinicians can use to guide their clinical decisions about which antibiotic is best for the right patient.
Just curious, I've written about this operation called Civica RX that's working with hospitals to fill a gap where there's a shortage of a medicine. It's disappeared for whatever reason, and they're working with hospital systems. They're providing incentives, essentially, to say, if we can guarantee a certain price, if you'll make the product we need. Is there anything to that approach that could be applied to the antibiotics right now? Any takers?
Certainly I think on the food animal side, there is, and I think even on the food animal side, are there antibiotics or other modalities, as Helen mentioned, vaccines and barrages and others, that could be used that wouldn't have an impact necessarily on antimicrobial resistance in human people. So, as long as food producers can still afford to stay in business, as Evan says, if you can't stay in business, you're not going to be of very much use to anybody. We all need medications. We all need food. So if there's a way to make it profitable for farmers and ranchers, I think they'd be willing to try just about anything.
I mean, one other point, as you're thinking about the next question, Ed, that I think is really important about the Disarm Act and the legislation that we're talking about. All the industry is really asking for is a level playing field, to be able to compete on the basis of the attributes of the product so that physicians actually can make the right choice for the patient. The reimbursement system that we're actually, the separate reimbursement scheme that we're asking for antibiotics is not at an exorbitant price. All we're asking for is to be able to be reimbursed at average sales price, or ASP. I mean, society is going to set that price overall in terms of both the commercial as well as the Medicare and Medicaid payers. And so it's not as if, we're asking for an exorbitant, incentive, as people like to talk about it. It's really for an average sales price that allows the formularies to actually have the ability to make the decision based on the attributes of the product and not worry about their pharmacy budget on a year-over-year basis.
Here's another question from the audience. The public policy response to COVID was not higher prices and payments, but more direct push investments into leading pharma firms. Would this push approach to AMR be faster and more politically feasible than efforts to increase pull incentives such as high prices, Medicare, NTAP payments, or innovation prizes even?
Well, I'll start that one off. So we have had a lot of success with push, right? So push is CARB-X. That's a push incentive. It's been incredibly successful. If you go to their website, you see a beautiful pipeline of compounds in early development across the spectrum, drug, bacteriophage, microbiome, diagnostics. We haven't talked about diagnostics, but they're a very important part of solving this problem. And I think that all the milestones have been met and the funders are happy, right? I think push has been very successful. And we've shown, I can remember being in these kinds of discussions where people said, well, you're just underestimating the scientific hurdle here. The problem isn't the market. The problem is that there's no innovation, there's no discovery. I think that a push incentive like CARB-X, public-private partnership, has shown that it works. There are other advantages, other examples of push that have been successful as well. But I think many people agree now that push has been maybe optimized, is a fair word, and that the main kind of bottleneck is at approval, right? We have compounds that have made it to approval and the company has not been able to keep it on the shelf in my pharmacy so that I could use it for a patient who needed it. And that's the horrible thing, right? When we have a patient who needs it, they need it now. I don't have time to get it from a warehouse or from across town. And that is the real crush. We've had to learn about the cost of keeping a drug on the shelf, right? That used to never be discussed because there was enough marketing to pay for all those expenses of the post-marketing studies like Evan was mentioned, and all the safety stuff for the FDA. That's the kind of expense that is putting these companies out of business.
Yeah, and push has even gone beyond CARB-X, Helen, as you know. I mean, BARDA has given hundreds of $millions, let's say, for instance, for Acagen to develop their novel aminoglycoside. 9 months after they got approval, Acagen filed for bankruptcy, and they sold their product to an Indian company for $16 million. I don't think that that's really where the U.S. government wants to put its dollars at the end of the day. So there are other pull incentives that are novel. BARDA has put that out, for novel products to be considered for bioterrorism. Our product is being looked at for pulmonary anthrax. They've given us dollars to develop U.S.-based onshoring manufacturing, which we're excited about being able to do that because it fits with the Executive Order 13944, specifically around providing essential medicines, and antibiotics are clearly on that list. And I think that these kind of public-private partnerships are another solution. And I do think some type of subscription agreement is something that should be considered. At the end of the day, the way the legislators think about it, there's got to be a pay for somewhere in order to keep a budget neutral approach. So I think there's a lot more work to do on that side. I do think that the reimbursement reform providing some real good elasticity for pricing in hospital-based IV antibiotics is really something that is in the near term going to be something very important for the marketplace writ large.
Well, thank you. I think with that, we've run over a little bit on our panel, but I hope everybody enjoyed this. I want to thank our panelists, Evan, Gail, Helen, for this very interesting discussion and a lot of insights that I think people can chew on for a while. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt for closing remarks.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for what's been an amazing discussion. Thank you to all of you who put in questions. There are still so many of them. Thanks to Senator Cassidy for joining us earlier and for mentioning Warren Zevon so many times. And keep an eye out for our next STAT virtual event next week with my colleague Drew Joseph, who will be talking with a panel of experts about the COVID-19 pandemic's toll on mental health. More information can be found on our website. Be sure to sign up and join us. I'd also like to thank Merck for sponsoring today's event. Until then, everyone, please stay safe and be well.